Hey, everybody. Welcome. This is Michael Bracy with the Music Policy Forum. I'm joining you from just outside of Washington, D.C. Today is Friday, March 5th, and we are thrilled that you're with us for another edition of Music Policy Forum Live. Usually, many of us this time of year, we'd be getting ready to head to Austin to eat some tacos and hear some music and talk to a lot of really smart people and enjoy March Madness. I'm wearing my vintage Patrick Ewing jersey because it's the end of the basketball season, and normally we're getting geared up for the tournament. It's been complicated to have your favorite basketball player coach your alma mater and not be as good at coaching as you would hope, but we are soldiering through, and we're proud of our Hoyas, and they've really battled this year. So we're excited about the end of the season. But most importantly, we're so appreciative that you're joining us today. We know that you all have a lot on your plate, a lot of things to do with your Fridays. And we always appreciate you thinking it's a good use of your time to spend some of it with us. We have a great show today with some fantastic guests we'll be getting to in just a minute. First, some housekeeping for those of you who have not joined us before. Again, this is a conversation program about music ecosystems, about the interrelationship between local governments, actually all levels of government, philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, the music industry, audiences. What can we do? What should we be doing? What are people doing to not only navigate the complexities of COVID and the shutdown, but more broadly, how are we collectively building infrastructure and partnership and alignment that can create stronger, more resilient, and more equitable music ecosystems? All of our programs, again, are available on our website, musicpolicyforum.org. Our producer, Alex Dolvin, today will be putting relevant information in the chat window, links and other things, so you can kind of follow along with some other resources. If you have questions, we encourage them. We love your questions. Use the Q&A chat function on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And just a lot of things going on. So quickly, a couple of news updates like we do every week. It's a lot happening, of course, here on Capitol Hill, here in DC. The SBA is slowly moving towards finalizing the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant notice in terms of timeline and application and final rules. They updated their FAQ on Monday, but sort of a kind of a bigger issue, and we'll talk about this with Hal later. Senator Schumer, the majority leader, has indicated that he is intending to put an amendment into the stimulus plan that's being debated in the Senate as we speak, that would basically have the impact of not forcing venues to choose between the PPP program and the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant program. That would be a real boon for venue owners and operators who have been really struggling to think about and decide what would be a better option for them in terms of where to apply when the time is right. And if that legislation is included in the Senate bill and ultimately in the final package that'll be passed next week by the House, that will really have some relief. Hal and I will talk a little bit about that later in some more detail. Other news that many of you follow this stuff closely, saw a SoundCloud announced this week they're becoming one of probably the largest platform that is shifting their payout model for artist royalties to a pay listener, sort of a pay per listen model based on what fans are listening to, subscribers are listening to. This is something that's been talked about as a potential way of changing the economic pie in terms of how royalties go on the larger platforms. It'll be interesting to see how that moves and plays out on the SoundCloud side. Of course, Tidal, the streaming platform, was bought by Square, which is a part of the Twitter family of companies. Square has played a very interesting role, and I think most would agree a very helpful role in helping the economics in terms of touring musicians and merch tables and just e-commerce solutions. It'll be interesting to see what Jack Dorsey and the Tidal team are cooking up down the road in terms of that stuff. We're going to be talking a lot about that in next week's program with journalist Liz Pelly and Kevin Erickson from Future of Music Coalition and artist and activist Aaron McCowan. That's going to be a great conversation next Friday. But before we get to our guests this week, I want to welcome in Josh Antonuccio. Did I get it right? I'm so bad with names. From University of Ohio. And we asked Josh to join us briefly at the front of the program because he is organizing, and his team is organizing certainly one of the most impressive conferences that I have ever seen. This has been coming across my social feeds for the last 6 weeks, and it's just one superstar after another has been added to this agenda. So it's open to the public, and registration is ongoing. And I just asked Josh to come in and talk a little bit about what they're doing with this event and how people can tap in if they're interested. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I'm just going to put a link to the conference in the chat here if you're interested in learning more. But yeah, so this is the 3rd annual Ohio University Music Industry Summit. We're really thrilled. We've been trying to really develop a conference. It's a combination of well-known artists of the moment. So we have Run the Jewels in their management team, Phoebe Bridgers, St. Vincent, Phineas. We had a really great conference lined up just on the heels of South by last year. Yeah, and Michael, thank you for mentioning South by. It's so hard not to be down there right now. But obviously that was canceled. So we really wanted to create something that could sustain the current moment, but also be accessible to as many as possible people that we could bring in. So creating a virtual platform with Nashville-based Red Story, we're trying to invite as many people in. We've made registration free. And so we have artists on one side. On the other hand, we've got a lot of great industry leaders, Raymond Leon Roker for Amazon Music, Jennifer, my gosh, lost her last name for the moment. Forgive me, Jennifer. Jen Malone, music supervisor from Euphoria and Atlanta. And it's just been a really great combination of people. And really, Future of Music was a big, those conferences were so kind of inspirational and informative to me when I was getting started in things. And so that's the model, is to create a place for conversation and learning. And again, to make it accessible to as many people as want to join us. So we've also got a really great panel of people in the live event space dealing with some of the issues you're talking about. Rev Moose from NEVA, Candace Newman from Live Out Live, and venue owners from across the state, and some other national leaders as well. Shane Shapiro actually is leading that panel, who I first met at Future Music at Georgetown in 05, 06. So anyways.
Awesome. Well, Josh, we're so happy for the conference, and thank you for joining, and thanks for putting the link in the chat. People should definitely check it out. It's really impressive, and really happy to help spread the word. So have a great event, and it's great to see you, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks. Take care, Michael.
Cheers. Now I'm thrilled to bring in our first guest, Bill Johnson, General Manager at WRTI Radio in Philadelphia, and so much more. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here.
Where'd you go?
Waiting for permissions on the video. There we go.
There we go. So Bill, just to kind of kick things off, just start big picture, if you don't mind, and talk a little bit about, you wear so many hats, but talk a little bit about the kind of the day job had at RTI, and sort of where that fits into some of the other work that you've been doing for quite some time.
Sure. You're right about a lot of hats, so let me just get the right one on here. WRTI is a jazz and classical station here in Philadelphia. We're a non-commercial public media station, and I'm the general manager. And what that means is I'm generally responsible for everything. And in particular, I think the challenge of having a station that's half classical and half jazz and all music is is special. We were the first station like that in the country back in 1997. Now I think we're up to 3. And what you quickly realize is you have 2 full-time stations, with 24 hours in the day. So you immediately recognize you're underserving people who love one or the other. And for us, we've been able to kind of bridge the gap, and about 1/3 of our audience actually listens to both classical and jazz, which is really satisfying given when we started the format. I think we had about 2 or 3% of the audience listening to both classical and jazz, and now today to have it at 1/3 of the audience, and that's been true for almost 15 years. It's just really satisfying. I think it's a testament to the idea that if you don't get locked into a particular genre and you just remind people, look, it's the same music, or it's the same notes. We organize them differently, but give it a try, open up your mind, and you might hear something that you identify with that sort of drags you in and introduces you to a new world of expression. So we're really satisfied, to have reached that point. For me, my job is really the stress and anxiety of keeping it all going every day, all day long. We belong to Temple University. They own the license. It's a big major market with a lot of incredible music makers and musicians. And this notion that, in order to meet our mission, which is to champion music as a vital cultural resource, if we really embrace that, it's a huge job. So I think every day, all day long, we all are challenged by, are we living up to that? What are we missing? And there's always something more you could be doing. And we're just sort of in an endless search to try to get to that point of what's the next thing that we can do to make a difference for the music community.
I think something that we talk a lot about in this program, and we think a lot about, and you and I have talked about a bunch, is as we kind of think about the evolution of public radio away from being a radio station that has a license and a signal and a tower and the rest of that, and into sort of the language that, again, Tom Mara and our friends at KXP talk a lot about being a locally based music nonprofit that is multifaceted. And I think one thing that's interesting that I don't know that people think about, maybe everybody thinks about it, I just don't talk about it, but the sort of historical anomaly that so many of our public radio stations do have that educational anchor that you are embedded in Temple, which has, of course, this broader mission beyond having a radio station. And could you talk a little bit about like how you think about your core mission as an organization and how it relates to being part of the university community?
Sure. The reality is, I think all of us as music stations are cultural institutions, especially in public media, where the first thing we think about is service. And I think that's, frankly, it sounds kind of obvious now, but I don't think it has been as obvious in the past. I think we have thought of ourselves as radio stations. But the reality is we are touching communities in so many different ways. We work with so many presenters and individual musicians and educators that we are part of the fabric of the local cultural community. And as we broaden our awareness that we're cultural institutions, that actually changes the relationship we have with our license holders. In our case, a university, and most public stations are owned by universities, educational licensees. And so we are always thinking about our role as a steward and a representative of Temple University and their mission. How are we representing the university in the work that we do? Is this, a good example of Temple's values? So you're carrying that it's not weight, but you're carrying that responsibility as part of your own organization's, mission and values and public statements. So it's not a dual identity. And when it works well, they dovetail, right? When it works really well, it's I belong to an institution that's dedicated to public service and is really dedicated to the community and really wants to make a difference. And in all of those things, we can find ourselves in public media. And so there's lots of common ground to create language that, supports both of those narratives, at the station level and at the university level. I think when it doesn't work well, you've got a more transactional existence. And that's really one of the big barriers is, are you in a situation where you can be guided by your mission? Or are you in a situation where you're more controlled day by day by rules and regulations and compliance and transactional things that may take you off point from your mission? Or at the very least, slow you down, right? In terms of pursuing that mission because you're just sort of bogged down in checking off those boxes. So it's a challenging thing. And I know that there's a lot of different flavors of relationships between stations and universities. So it's definitely not monolithic. Some of us have pretty good relationships like I think RTI and Temple do. But I know others, if you're in a school of communications, for instance, they have a very academic approach to their relationship with their public media station, in which case you're going to have more involvement by faculty and students, in the academic side. We happen to report to the business side of the university. Right. So we tend to have a more business approach, which is great for me because 90% of our money comes from outside of Temple University, and I need to be able to think like a business as opposed to a department within a university. So it's all over the place.
And building off that, I mean, this notion of thinking as a business and thinking about mission. We are, I think a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated, quote unquote, the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act, which did a lot of things. One of the things it did is it directly paved the way for massive consolidation in the commercial radio space and fundamentally changed the role that commercial radio played in music and culture, which created space for non-com to kind of jump in and take that, and I'm curious, how you would think about that sort of evolution over the last couple, maybe 15, 20 years of non-com radio kind of stepping in that void that was left by the commercial sectors. They kind of became more, they lost live and local, they shuttered genres, things like that.
Yeah. For us, it's a very direct, effect, right? We went from being an all jazz station to a half jazz, half classical station in 1997. You can connect the dots, and that happened because the commercial classical station was sold a bunch of times in a 2.5 year period. And they were able to survive holding on to the format each time until the last time, right? And that last time, somebody bought it and said, hey, I'm switching the format and there's no more classical music in Philadelphia. Boom, done. That's it. Yeah. And I still hear from people who say, the 10 days without classical music on the radio in 1997 were the worst 10 days of my life. It had that big an impact on them. And so I often use that as an example of what differentiates us, from commercial radio is, we wake up every day thinking about how to sustain, the music and the service that we have on the air and how to serve. And, I don't want to, vilify, commercial media, but that's not the primary motivation. It's to make money. And so we just need to understand the roles that we each play in the system. And so I think it's naive to expect commercial private, media to be in the service business. They are in the profit-making business. And if we want to care for music and we want to care for communities and the artists, I think public media has stepped in to say, we are the people who, no matter what, will figure this out. We will find a way. And I've seen examples of stations that have bought local theaters, in order to keep music presented. I've seen examples of stations who have stepped up and have tens of thousands of students served each year in schools. I just think that, starting from a place of mission and service means that we can really have the biggest impact on the music ecosystem. And we should own that. And I go back to, I don't think we always have. And I think that's hurt us as a business because it's meant we've left a lot of money on the table and we've lost a lot of ground in terms of making the case for who we are, but we're catching up pretty quick.
Yeah. And this notion of service leads me to, Jazz Philadelphia and sort of the community building, infrastructure building efforts that you've been involved in locally. Could you talk us through Jazz Philadelphia and kind of what that strategy has looked like?
Sure. I'd say a few years ago, there was an effort underway by the Wingcoat Foundation to better understand the jazz ecosystem in Philadelphia. And they funded some research, which was pretty comprehensive. And a lot of us were interviewed to talk about our roles in the jazz ecosystem, whether it was broadcasting, whether it was musicians, whether it was presenters, whether it was the city of Philadelphia businesses. And out of that came a body of research that allowed them to come up with the conclusion of, what we need to do is we need to put together a team of people in Philadelphia, who represent these various constituent groups. And more importantly, this team of people need to check their egos at the door. They need to be people who are committed to the bigger ideal of furthering jazz in Philadelphia. And even more than that, they need to be committed to the idea that the only way you can do that is by engaging in something called collective impact. And so spending the time to really talk to the community, hold the meetings, build the working groups so that they can have a voice in representing what their interests are. And that becomes the agenda for Jazz Philadelphia. And so that's what was done. And, it's still a work in progress. Collective impact is an arduous, way to build anything. But what you end up with is something that is representative of the needs of your community because they've been involved and engaged from day one. Mm-hmm. And so that's what Jazz Philadelphia is it's designed to lift all boats, in the jazz community. It is designed to be of service to all its constituents in the jazz community. We're not interested in competing. We are interested in serving, and we're interested in listening. And so to that end, all of the programs that we've created have been designed to try to achieve that. And it's arguable whether we're succeeding, every day in every way. But I'd like to think that we are moving the needle on that. And, it's slow, but it's steady progress, and it's hard progress. But our team has done an amazing job. Heather Blakesley, who's the executive director, and Gerald Veasley, the great bassist, who was the president. I just think they've both done an extraordinary job of focusing all of us on here's some concrete things that we think actually represent what we're hearing in collective impact and make for a healthier jazz community.
It's so great and been such an inspiration, I think to all of us, because again, collective impact is such a great framing for it, because that's really what we're trying to do. It's all it's about accountability. It's about leveraging assets. It's about visioning. It's about lifting each other up. The music community has in many cases, a reputation for just being cutthroat and zero-sum game. And if somebody's doing well, someone's getting hurt, and it's we're not going to thrive and build that kind of world we'd like to build if we're not, really trying to put the pieces together.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the smartest things that came out of the Wyncote research was simply this idea of putting together a group of people who truly were trying to do the best thing they could for jazz. Yeah. Even though you had a club owner in the room, and even though you had a musician in the room, and you had an educator, we all looked at each other and we just said, all of those things get checked at the door, and we're going to sit around this table and we're going to try to do our best to serve. Yeah. We're not perfect, but I like to think that wisdom to put us together in that way with that direction, helped get to where we are. And it certainly helped us embrace the collective impact model. Like if you're just sitting there because, you're counting the hours or the days or the weeks until, you can take advantage of what's being created, for your club or for your next gig or whatever, it's just the wrong mindset. It's just absolutely the wrong mindset in order for this to work. So we're very fortunate to have an amazing team of people who have just come together with that mentality and continue to have it to this day. Here we are years later, and everybody who's involved continues to be asking the question, like, how can we continue to serve, this community and make a difference for the people we care about?
And we're going to revisit this later in the show, and we're going to talk to Hal about some of the work with Save Our Stages. But, part of, again, what we talk a lot about in this program is what are the implications of this sort of, revelatory moment of advocacy and awareness that the shutdown has led to, that people are really thinking about and talking about and advocating, not just for music, but for arts and culture in ways that, maybe we'll finally have the breakthrough we've been hoping for a long time, which is let's not look at this through, sort of a commercial market lens or a consumer lens, but let's really have the re-articulation of why this stuff matters and what we collectively can and should do and need to do to make it happen, other than just, rely on end stage capitalism to kind of make it all work.
Boy, that's a
long wait. And then we're going to bring Hal in, and then we'll bring you back to talk more about Philadelphia. But I was really excited to read the announcement about your inclusion, WRTI's inclusion in the Jazz Media Lab. Could you talk a little bit about what that initiative is and where that work's going to go?
I'm excited too. Not unlike the Wyncote research, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, sat down and did some hard work a few years ago of saying, we want to better understand jazz in America, the jazz ecosystem. And to me, it's like, when people with money come to the table and say, we care about this and we're willing to do the work and do it in the right way, that's when change can happen. And so that's what Doris Duke did. And at the time, they were really just talking to all of us, just trying to understand, we got notified last year that out of that, they had decided to make some strategic investments and create this thing called the Jazz Media Lab, which is 5 stations around the country, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, Denver, New York, and Philadelphia. And we are a cohort of 5 non-commercial stations who are working together. We're meeting on a regular basis. We're sharing information. There's research that's being done. And we're really trying to figure out how we can make a bigger difference in our own communities, but also model some things that other stations can take advantage of in the system and around the country. And so it's a sustained effort of 3 years of funding from Doris Duke. which again is a sign of how smart they are. They realize if you just get this 1 year, you're one and done, you're not really going to be focused on it. So the sustained investment allows us to be able to sort of free ourselves from day to day and seriously embrace this idea of what can we do together that we cannot do separately, that can only be done at scale and can only be done if we dedicate time and energy to talk to each other, think it through, work with each other, and take some risks, which is also part of the Duke grant, is they've included some capital to actually do some risk taking, which so many of us can't afford to do. So it's just a very smart, forward-thinking way to support jazz in America, and we're excited to be on the front end of it. We only had 2 meetings. We've got another one next week, so I'm looking forward to that.
And I'm really excited as a music fan. I always, jokingly say I'm sort of jazz curious, and the challenge with jazz criticism is if you don't understand, if you're not deep enough into it to understand the references, and so played with so and did this with this, and it's, now we've got this opportunity, of course, for experiential learning, and we can engage in things that were never before possible, and to see the leveraging of the passion and the expertise to figure out what could be done that we just haven't got our head around. And again, obviously we're just huge fans of the cohort model. And, everything about this last, year has been just a nightmare, but Zoom has created opportunities to do these multi-city cohorts and collaborations that really were not possible via conference calls. So
that is the silver lining out of all of this. I think we've learned that we can work together, in ways that it's not that they weren't possible before, but we weren't doing it. Yeah. Right. And now that we've been forced to do it, we're discovering that there's a lot of rich territory there. And so I think that's sort of the lasting effect of all of this, is that, we will continue to do that. We will continue not to hesitate to say, oh, no, they're in Portland. Sure, we can do something. We can talk. And that's not our inclination, because we're broadcasters and we're in one market and we're very focused on serving that market. So the entire mentality tends to shape itself around that. But it's important to open it up to a bigger perspective, because again, there are only things we can do at scale. And when it comes to jazz, it's only good music and bad music, just like all other music. And the more we can break away from this idea that you need to know all this inside baseball stuff, the more we're going to make it appealing to a greater number of people. And that's true, frankly, with all music, as far as I'm concerned. It's definitely true with classical. Right. Any music where we have a history of putting up walls. Mm-hmm. You have ears. Everybody, has ears for the most part. And what you hear is what you hear. And if you like it, you like it. And it's legitimate and it's valid, period. Now, if you want to learn more and go deeper, by all means, learn more and go deeper. But there shouldn't be a barrier, to participating in it based on a set of knowledge that somehow you need to acquire in order to just simply like something.
I think that's exactly right. And just a quick shout out to the platforms that you've been helping build in terms of the Non-Com Music Alliance and the idea of public radio stations across the country who are music facing, kind of coming together into more of a collaborative environment. So there's now infrastructure that, as the Media Lab is coming up with ideas and innovations, that people are more networked, not in terms of programming networks, but in terms of leadership collaborations and those type of things. So
yeah, and that's definitely happening here in Philadelphia. I'll give a shout out to XPN, and Hal will be on shortly. But XPN and an organization called Rec Philly here in Philadelphia, we all got together and did Black Music City, which is a phenomenal program that hopefully we can talk about later. But it's a perfect example of what can be done at a time like this, when people come together to do something that we weren't thinking of doing prior to the pandemic.
Awesome. Well, Bill, if you don't mind sticking around, we'll bring you back in a few minutes to talk some other Philadelphia stuff. And now I'm just thrilled to welcome Hal Real to the program. And Hal, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we all have had a busy day, so yours is probably not busier than everybody else's, but I know you've got a lot going on today. So,
yep. Thanks very much. Appreciate it, Michael. Good to see you, Bill.
Yeah. So, Hal, you've worn so many hats, or wearing so many hats in the community. Could you start just by talking a little bit about World Café Live and the role that organization plays, not just as a venue, but as much more than just a music venue? Could you just sort of talk a bit about the mission and history of the space?
Sure, honored to do so. Yeah, World Café Live opened in 2004 as one half of the House of Music at 3025 Walnut Street in West Philly, University City. The other half being our partners at WXPN. And it's been quite a journey. And of course, we did an average of 500 ticketed shows a year, a couple hundred free events and shows. And we are very much a community center, not only for concerts, but for community convenings, for tech conferences, for social events. We really are a gathering place for the community. And it's really important to us that we are so multifaceted and have become, a house of music and much more for so many of our fans and so many of our friends in the community. And a significant event for us, in addition to the more traditional house of concerts and partnering with XPN on lots of great joint ventures, is that in 2008, when the recession hit and the music programs in Philadelphia really were slashed, we couldn't sit idly by knowing we had some resources to see for however long Philadelphia students not be exposed to music. So we brought together a group of musicians and philanthropists and teachers and teaching artists and said, look, we've got resources we're willing to put in. What can we do? And we created what was then a nonprofit partner and we're now one nonprofit, one unified nonprofit. It's now World Café Live Education. And we put together a team of artists and started bringing in students at about 100 at a time for innovative, interactive sessions at World Café Live during the day. We do about 50 a year, about 100 students at a time. So we've had over 50 to 60,000 students since 2008 who've participated in these bridge sessions. And it's just been great. It's all about, not so much about turning kids into musicians as helping them see the world and culture through a musical lens, and to understand the interconnectivity of drums from Ghana with drums from Brazil, and of dance, in West Africa with dance in America, and everything you can imagine. That classical and blues and soul and hip hop all have so much in common. And that's been a great experience. We've always been very mission driven. And as a result of that work, we then started doing work in the schools and in the community, and it's just grown and grown. And so now, we're one unified nonprofit. We do lots of work at World Café Live, but also in the community.
Yeah, that's we have been so happy to showcase so many of the kind of creative youth development initiatives as that sector is just kind of becoming more and more robust. And it's always so encouraging just to see the local grassroots entrepreneurial, kind of energy around how do we, connect our youth to music in meaningful ways that, again, are not based on them being consumers or being marketed to, but really being welcomed into what music can bring, which, again, whether or not you want to pursue a career in the music industry or have the gift to record or perform, or you just appreciate it and just understand what it means. And it's so, again, I'm so happy to have you on with Bill today, because it's so interesting to think about the sort of ongoing investment in community nonprofit infrastructure that can really be transformational, while it's still just kind of doing the thing, but it's doing this thing too, in ways that we can't understand. Could you speak a little bit more, Hal, about your relationship with XPN and kind of how that came about and what that has meant for both organizations?
It's going back a ways now. I actually first approached XPN with the idea of creating this house of music in 1998. And it was 6 years later when the station moved in and we opened our two venues. Really, the notion was that at that time, there were lots of places for music in Philadelphia, not compared to today, but there were at least a handful of good places for live music in Philadelphia that really catered towards an under 30 audience. And we wanted to build a place that catered to all audiences of all ages, so that you didn't feel like you were too old if you were a music head like me and went in there at the age of 50, And you didn't feel too young if you were there, either, but it worked for everybody. And the notion was really to work with XPN also in terms of presenting emerging artists and being a house for that. So we licensed the name World Café for their radio show that at that time was, I don't know, maybe 15 years old, I forget. Now it's about 30 years old. At that time, it went to 7 stations around the country. Now it goes to over 200 stations. And so we became the physical extension of that virtual cafe. I can remember the tourist office people in Philadelphia saying, wow, now when people come and say, where's World Cafe? We don't have to say it's virtual. We can say 3025 Walnut.
Yeah.
So it was terrific. We spent a lot of time, Roger LeMay, Bill's counterpart and my partner who runs WXPN, we spent a lot of time the first 2 years explaining around the country. We're 2 different organizations. One's nonprofit public radio, the other is the music venues, but we live together under one roof and share a common philosophy. And after 2 years of giving those speeches, we realized nobody cared. All they cared about was, who owned it and how it worked didn't matter. What mattered was it was this great vibe, this great house of music. Was the music great? Was your beer cold? Wow, this is really wonderful. And that's where it's gone. And we've created great programming together, from our Friday free at noon concerts that are webcast all over the world now, to the non-commercial radio conference every spring, and lots of other things that we do. So it's been great for representing the Philadelphia music scene, and being a real kind of, as I said, house of music for Philly.
Well, I can certainly attest to the fact that the programming at the non-com convention was spectacular, and the beer was delicious. So well done on both fronts. But so I wanted to broaden out a little bit and talk about your role with NEVA and the National Independent Venue Association, of course. And what an amazing success story. And we've talked a bunch about it on the show, so we don't need to do kind of the whole war stories about how it started. But could you talk a little bit about your perspective on that organization coming together and the role that you're playing on the board?
Yeah, I'm glad to. Thank you. I do have to go back to how it started because it very much informs my perspective.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important for people to understand that the idea of starting NEVA predated the pandemic.
Okay.
And it was just February 24th of 2019 when Reverend Moose, our executive director, and I met in New York and had lunch. And I said, Moose, you started Independent Venue Week. We from World Cafe Live want to put some of our assets, our resources, and my time into organizing independent venues to have a collective voice, because we're all too busy keeping the lights on, but we really need to get together. There's a lot that we can do to help each other. And we said, yep. I said, I don't want to step on your toes if that's where you're headed. He said, nope, but I'd love to work on it with you. We said, great. This summer, we'll get a bunch of people together in Philly, form a steering committee, and see what happens. And 3 weeks later, February 13th was our last show. We've been dark for almost a year. I'm sorry, March 13th. And we said, we can't wait until the summer. We need to get that steering committee on the phone right now. And fast forwarding a year later, there's 3,000 members of NEVA in all 50 states and in DC. Our mission when I met with Moose was not at all about, this tremendous advocacy program that we created. Advocacy was part of what we do, but it was about sharing best practices and things like that. But under the circumstances, we quickly realized that we needed to try to save this sector or it was going down. And that's tough to do with a sector that's had no voice. Nobody knew what we meant by independent venue even.
Right.
And for people participating, the quick definition is these are locally controlled, primarily, mom and pop businesses or small nonprofit organizations. These are nonprofit, they're for-profit, they're venues, they're festivals, and there are some promoters as well who work with these kinds of facilities and festivals. We had an existential need. It was quite clear to us that we were the first to close and we will be the last to open. You know, people asked a lot over the last year, well, you've got drive-in concerts and you've got virtual concerts. And we're like, those are grains of sand for an industry that needs a beach. You know, we knew that, and lately there's been so much talk about rapid reopening and so forth. Well, I was just interviewed on the local news in Philly earlier this week, and they may not have liked what I had to say, but the question was, you know, aren't you excited about the rollback of the restrictions? And I said, the restrictions aren't what's keeping us closed. I mean, yeah, they mandated our closure. It's the pandemic. We're not going to reopen. We can't reopen if it's not safe for our staff, for our performers, and for our fans, our guests. We have no interest in doing that. And partial reopening for an industry that can barely get by at 100% is just the road to ruin. So we made our case. And, you know, in a time when there was a lot about our democracy that gave us all pause, it was very reaffirming for those of us involved in this lobbying effort that we literally got to know every member of Congress, their legislative director, their chief of staff, and had tremendous bipartisan support, which speaks volumes about music. We could get on these calls, whether they were Republicans and or Democrats, and say, look, this isn't a big city issue. This isn't a small town issue. It's rural, it's urban, it's red and it's blue. It's music, it's concerts. And the support that we got just shows that. Now, we hardly expected when we started the social media movement and the tagline behind me, Save Our Stages, that would end up in a $15 billion piece of legislation. But we're thrilled that it did. And of course, that legislation benefits a lot more than just NEVA and its members. And that's great. Our whole thing was this needs to benefit the businesses who have suffered the most during the pandemic. So, you know, I think the threshold for the act is like if you've lost 30% of your revenue compared to 2019. NEVA members have lost 90%, in our case, 110%. Not only do we have no revenue to speak of since March, we've had hundreds of thousands of dollars of tickets to refund, of event deposits to refund. It's truly an economic disaster. And flipping the script for a second, very importantly, we are going to be critical to a resilient recovery.
Yep.
If these places across the country are boarded up, we're not going to be putting heads in beds in hotels, filling bars, filling restaurants, and creating that dynamic that everybody really needs to be successful in their nightlife economy. So it has been a silver lining. Speaking, I know Bill was talking about silver linings and you were. It's been a silver lining for all of us to misery loves company, to be working together. You have all these venues that are shut down and all these people who really needed the camaraderie. We're so excited about our plans beyond the pandemic, but right now our focus is on implementation of what's called the Shuttered Venue Operators Grants, the SVOG, along with safe reopening and being a leader to help our venues and other venues open safely, get confidence, you know, make the public confident that we are not super spreaders, we are safe places to come and go back to enjoying live music. And that's the short-term goal.
You said so much there, Hal, to build off of. I really appreciate all that. You know, certainly just to amplify on the safety side, of course, that's, you know, we've been very proud of the Reopen Every Venue Safely, or REVS initiative. On March 15th, we're announcing the 2021 cohort cities that are coming on board to supplement our 2020 pilot cities, and we'll be dedicating this program to that topic on March 19th. But you're exactly right, because this is a challenge, a communications challenge for our community that we've never thought about before. This is about people to turn out for the rock show. This is about trust and transparency, and a lot of what has been incredibly edifying to me and our REVS team has been the commitment that our community partners have had around the health and safety of venue employees and musicians and crew. And obviously, you know, to navigate the economic crisis with the other side of the crisis is a really difficult balance. But, you know, this community has really stepped up in ways that give us a lot of hope for the future. And I loved, what you said about NEVA. It's one thing to organize in a crisis and fight for the lives. And it's another thing to say, where does this power take us? Where do we go with this? What could this mean? And to the conversation that Bill and I were having a few minutes ago, how does this fit into the challenge that all music advocates have had, or many of us have had for a long time, which is how do we fundamentally realign the value of music and culture in our society? And what does that look like in pragmatic ways? So thank you so much for your work, and thank you for walking us through some of that history. That's great to hear, and it's such a great reminder. Stuff that deja vu, stuff that we always said back in the day in our early future music days. Policy gets made by those who show up, and the only barrier to make it impossible for the music community to not succeed in the policy process is to not get in the policy process. Do the work. People want to hear. They want to know what's going on. So it's super interesting. So as a reminder, folks, if you have questions for these superstar guests, put them in the Q&A. We're happy to kind of get your feedback, and there's some great stuff in the chat that we're seeing, which is really nice. Thank you for your comments. And Bill, I'd like to bring you back in as well and ask both of y'all, thinking about kind of post-pandemic and thinking about just how what you're talking about, this kind of explosion of activism, engagement, what are, and Bill, thinking about sort of the collective impact partnerships and then the cohorts and the national organizing. Where do we take this? Like, how do we start to get our head around what it looks like for us to play offense as a community, both in terms of policy and philanthropy, and kind of building off this so it's not, again, just a short-term response to a crisis, that we've seen over and over again with, with hurricane relief and things like that. But this is really creating something that could be transformative over time. Easy question. Why don't y'all solve that for me?
Hal, from where I sit, I go back to one of the amazing things to come out of the pandemic, right, was this awareness that we can affect change, right? Here we all are sitting in our different, homes, offices, or whatever, just connected digitally. And we've discovered that we can band together and make a difference. And the challenge is not to lose sight of what we're making a difference for, right? Because that's the driver as far as I'm concerned. It's the joy, the passion that we all have for the music. And there's no end point to how good the music community can be, right? For those of us who love it, it's endless, right? We always want more. We always want, as many people as possible in the fold. And so to not lose sight of that means you have an endless well to draw from, to advocate for it. And no matter how many clubs we have compared to the number of musicians we have who should be playing somewhere, it's always going to pale in comparison. No matter how many, great recordings there are out there, there's always going to be a limited number of radio stations and a limited number of hours in the day in order to be able to share that and get that out to the public. So it feels to me like we can, if we're focused on this goal of just driving social change, and I just come right out and say it because this is really why I'm in any of this space, driving social change through the model of music, right? The model of being more sensitive and listening to each other and learning from each other, and having more care, for the planet and sensitivity for each other. Like, if we're driven by that, I think we can continue to dig into this well. We've created a skill set now, right? We've exercised that a little bit. We've got some muscle here. If we can attach to that this vision and this desire to have the most robust and dynamic music communities, ever, then I think that will continue to drive and build on that muscle that we've all discovered that we have, that just needs to continue to work out.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Bill. I think there's a huge opportunity in front of us. And I think that opportunity requires all of us who've gotten in the game because there was an existential crisis. As Bill was saying, to stay in the game now is the challenge. We have 3,000 venues, and we're all going to be going back to work. We look forward to reopening World Cafe Live, and my day job is going to overshadow time I have for NEVA compared to what I've had. But starting locally with NEVA, to say, or nationally, we now have a network of 3,000 outlets that can make a huge difference, that never even talk to each other. And so, for example, our goal down the road is we're looking at the continuum of music experiences and music industry from a venue perspective. And we are going to try, in long-term goals for NEVA, to have venues across the country adopt the kind of music education and community engagement programming that we do at World Cafe Live and others do around the country as part of what an independent venue should do and how it should relate to their community. So those who are in K through 12 are exposed, and we're developing these audiences for the future because they're exposed to jazz and classical as well as rock and pop and hip hop and blues. And we're also going to expose them to the careers that exist besides being performers, because we're all developing vocational training programs for young adults who can become employees, not necessarily being on the stage, but all of the things it takes for you to have a venue and operate a venue or a radio station. And then we really want to diversify the industry and break down the barriers of senior management so that there are more women and more people, more brown and black people who are senior managers and owners and developers of their own venues and their own businesses. It's a huge, intimidating undertaking when you think about it without a network, but when you have a network like we do, we really have the possibility of building these programs over years and making real change. The even bigger piece to me is NEVA has shown that we've got to get away from slicing the pie between nonprofits and for-profits. It's about the output. It's not about your legal structure. If you rely on investors or an owner to make your venue go, or you rely on donors because you're a nonprofit to make your venue go, it doesn't mean that you don't still have more in common. You're still booking shows, selling tickets, hiring staff, attracting audiences. It's about the output. And you can be very mission-driven, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit. Nonprofits can be altruistic, and so can for-profits, and vice versa. You can be not so mission-driven and still be a nonprofit. So we think blurring those lines are important. And when you look at federal arts policy, and I'm the chair of one of the NEA 6 regional arts organizations, the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, in the federal lingo, the arts means nonprofit arts. And that's a lost opportunity. I could go on like Bill and wax poetic about the importance of music to our spirit and to the cultural heart of this country. That's not how NEVA succeeded. That's not how we got the Save Our Stages Act. That just wouldn't have worked. We got it because we talked about for every dollar you spend at World Cafe Live, you spend $12 in the community. We made the economic argument. If we successfully make that economic argument in such a big way across the country, and the argument that the arts are a right, not a privilege, it's not for the elite few, it's for everybody, and we mean it by having grant programs for musicians, for organizations that may not be 501c3s, knock down some of those barriers, and really diversify both from an arts maker and an arts presenter, diversify that playing field. My gosh, what a renaissance, what a blossoming we could have for the whole art scene in this country. But we've got to break down these traditional barriers. The notion that federal arts policy has baked into it that it means nonprofit, and it generally means nonprofit 501c3s.
Right.
Has to change.
Yeah, and it's been, we've talked a bunch on the show about, again, trying to step beyond, the immediacy of the crisis and the implementation of the shuttered venues legislation, PPP, and the rest of it, and think about what does this moment mean, again, for a sector that not to be disrespectful towards anybody, but, in many ways has been willing to, look at a 5% increase or decrease in NEA funding as a proxy for cultural policy that, when you all of a sudden an organization catalyzes a movement that leads to $15 billion, which is of course more money than the National Endowment of the Arts has received combined over their 50-year history. What does that make? How does that reframe that entire discussion? And what's exciting in the sector right now, people who are attending this program, people who are in the field, have been thinking about this, been working on this, are thinking big and thinking structural and thinking about, as the Biden administration comes together, where do we need to fit into these different pieces? I mean, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about in our networks is the infrastructure bill. Again, the relief bill is going to pass next week, and that's going to have a lot of things that are going to be very impactful and very necessary. And then they're going to be back in September with a massive infrastructure bill. Where do we fit into that bill? Where does public media fit into that? Where does physical infrastructure and space and the creative youth development sector and all that? So these are again, I think many of us are taking away, part of the lesson again of Save Our Stages is if, Moose and Hal and Dana, and of course, it's not a number of individuals, it's a whole army of folks that work their ass off for months and months and months and were relentless to get this legislation passed. But, everybody is thinking about how to up their game. We have a great question from Gary Stewart, and I'm glad Gary is with us today. Gary deserves a tremendous amount of credit for his work in Philadelphia, and now has gone on to do tremendous work at the Bonfield Stanton Foundation in Denver and as a national leader at the intersection of arts, culture, and philanthropy. And, I think, Hal, his question, you kind of anticipated some of the things he was asking around these silos and divisions between nonprofit and for-profit. Maybe, I don't know if either of you would care to speak to kind of his more pointed question, which is philanthropy, in their role funding the nonprofit side of the house, has it really been part of the problem? Is that something that needs to be thought about or addressed or could be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I did anticipate Gary and I go way back, and I think we've had this conversation for years. It's not just philanthropy, though. It's also government. I mean, it's not just individual philanthropy. It's government, it's foundations, and it is individual philanthropy as well. I mean, one of the amazingly reaffirming things about NEVA is while we've been waiting to get some federal relief, we had to do something. So we did our Save Our Stages Festival in partnership with YouTube. We've done fundraising. So we raised $3 million literally to help some of our members whose landlords were like, that's it, I'm done. To be able to give them a $10,000 check to hold them off for a little bit. We did that from individuals. We did that from some big gifts from corporations, but we did it from people who never thought about stepping up and saying, you know what, it's really important in my community that I have a place like World Cafe Live to go to, with my friends, with my kids, to see my kids play on stage, to do all the reasons that were important to the community. And it's elevated everybody's sense. I know just the support that we got for our employees from our own emergency relief fund, from the people who came for years and were served them, a beer or took their ticket, and people got it. And I hope that we can capitalize on that new awareness and can change the playing field on all the levels Gary mentions, and even at the individual level. And that people, when they have the opportunity to say, yeah, add $5 to my ticket to help support you, that they do so. Because they realize, it's important.
Yeah.
It's vital.
We are sadly at time. And I'd love to ask both of you in closing if there was one thing that either is living on your websites, an archived event, something coming up in the next month or so, one thing you would love for our audience to check out that you've been involved with or you think they'd really enjoy. What would that be? Does something jump to mind, something either upcoming or something recently?
Yeah. Two things. I'm going to cheat. NPR live sessions. WRTI has a site there where we've just been producing videos, and I think it's just our best talent doing their best work, reaching a national stage, and we're really excited about it. The second thing is Black Music City, which is a project with WXPN, Rec Philly, and WRTI. We got together, got $50,000 in order to get dollars in the hands of Black creatives, to to celebrate Philadelphia's music tradition, to pay homage to the music tradition. And we are going through this now. We've an additional $20,000 was raised on top of that. And it's an amazing project where Black creatives are being given money directly to do what they do in an environment where they haven't been able to get the gigs and do the work. And it's creative work across all kinds of disciplines. And so that'll be announced in the next few weeks. But it's an amazing project, and it shows what public media can do when we come together and leverage our presence with a funder and say, hey, we can make this happen so that you get impact for the dollars that you want to give out philanthropically.
That's awesome. And Alex, thank you for putting those in the chat. And Hal, anything you'd point people to?
I would ask you to go to our website, worldcafelive.com, and check out all the incredible events and virtual events we're promoting for others and from our place. And if you're in the Philly area, absolutely take advantage of our curbside we do each weekend, and check out our duck cheesesteak, because it is a winner. There you go. How's that for arts and culture?
Well, Bill and Hal, thank you so much for spending time with us. We know you have so much going on. And of course, everyone who's watched today and participated, we really are just humbled that you spend your Fridays with us. And we really appreciate all the comments and feedback. Again, we welcome your questions, suggestions, ideas, gently worded constructive criticism at musicpolicyforum@gmail.com. We'll be back next Friday with Liz Pelly, Kevin Erickson, and Aaron McCown talking about streaming and the future of the economic structures in our community. And on March 19th, we'll be doing our Rev Showcase. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great week. Go Hoyas. See you guys.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mike.